From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon to celebrate the birthday of a very special writer, Elizabeth Bishop. My name is Anya Kreitney, come on in, and I'm the program specialist for the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress. I'm also a proud partner in this series representing and celebrating the careers of many of our most valuable literary voices. Elizabeth Bishop is one of those writers who shapes and contours our world as though it were putty. Her poetics are delicate yet solid, earthen yet water-bound, slippery yet confidently precise. She is a poet with a keen, unwavering eye, and lucky for us, she found no scene too domestic, no folk too ordinary, no object too small. So perhaps it gives you comfort, as it does many, to let Bishop, quiet and substantial as she was, study the boundary between the external and the internal, the boundary between border and flux. Absolutely, it is with this excitement that I welcome poets Jennifer Atkinson and Vijay Seshadri, both of whom will help us better understand Bishop and her poetics. Each poet will lecture for approximately 20 minutes, and both will conclude by sharing excerpts of their own work. And I should note that Vijay is going to share poems, Bishop's poems, here today, and then read poems at his conclusion. Jennifer Atkinson is the author of 5 poetry collections. The most recent, The Thinking Eye, looks at the syntax of our evolving world, paying close attention to landscape, ecology, myth, and memory. She is a professor in the BFA and MFA programs at George Mason University. Vijay Seshadri is the author of 3 collections, the most recent of which, 3 selections, won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 2014. He is a professor in the Michelle Tolela Myers Chair in Writing at Sarah Lawrence University in Yonkers, New York. Lastly, our event will conclude with a tabletop presentation of items that you see here to my left from the library's Bishop collection. And Mark Manavong here, sitting here in the front row, is a curator from the Rare and Special Book Division, and he will invite you all at the very end of the event to take a look at the items presented here. So before I turn it over to our poets here, let me ask you to turn off your cell phones or anything that could interfere with the reading today. And let me also say one little thing about the Poetry and Literature Center. We are the home of the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, who currently is Juan Felipe Herrera, and we put on 30 to 40 programs just like this one per year. To find out more about this series and others, please join our mailing list, and you can do so at the back of the room. There is a clipboard you can fill out. And without further ado, let me turn it over to our poets, first of whom is Jennifer Atkinson.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you Anya and Matt and Mark. This stuff is amazing. You have to see this if you haven't looked yet. So I'm going to talk a little bit and then read a few of like 3, I think, of my poems. And I'm going to concentrate on, it was very hard to pick like which Bishop poem to read and to think about, but I picked in the end a poem called Poem. Well, I'm going to start. Okay, I'll start. I'm sort of changing my mind right now while I talk to you, but no, I'm going to go ahead with this. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. So to celebrate Elizabeth Bishop on her birthday, let's begin with a snippet from one of her letters, her witty, sharp, funny, affectionate letters. It's a description of a remarkable birthday present that she received at a party in Brazil where she was living at the time. She writes, "A neighbor whom I scarcely know, because we have no known language in common for one thing, came bringing me my lifelong dream, a toucan. The woman who gave him and her husband are Polish refugees and ran the zoo in Warsaw, I think. I never dreamed they'd give me a toucan. He eats 6 bananas a day. I must say they seem to go right through him and come out practically as good as new. Meat, grapes, To see him swallowing grapes is rather like playing a pinball machine. And something I'd never known. They sleep with their tails straight up over their heads and their heads under a wing, so the silhouette is just like an inverted comma. I am calling him Uncle Sam, or Sammy. He steals everything, particularly something bright. But so far, the favorite toy is a champagne bottle cork, also from the birthday. That story sounds just like her, doesn't it? The Polish refugees who can't communicate with her exactly, and whose sad story she doesn't quite tell. The precise and strange images, feeding the bird grapes like playing a pinball machine, or his sleeping silhouette like an inverted comma. And like the sandpiper, that famous bishopy bird, Sam also keeps his eye open, looking for something, something, something. Something bright to steal from the random incoherence of the world. Other sources may call Bishop's pet bird Sam a parrot, or say she named him in a moment of chauvinistic patriotism, thus the Uncle Sam. But the story I choose to believe is the one that says Sam the toucan's name is an acronym for the 3 qualities Elizabeth Bishop deemed most important to a poem. Spontaneity, S, accuracy, A, and mystery, M. All or nearly all of her poems exhibit Samminess, but because it's one of my favorites, let's look at the poem. You know it, of course. It's an ars poetica of sorts, though Bishop would never use so grand a title. Even Marianne Moore's poetry is a step too close to pontification. Bishop sticks with poem. It's up to us to generalize. She claims only that poem is a poem about a naive, that is, unstudied painting. She doesn't claim, though we might, that poem might have something lasting to say about the art of poetry. So let me read it to you. It's in Geography 3. You can see a copy of that up here. Poem. About the size of an old-style dollar bill, American or Canadian, mostly the same whites, gray-greens, and steel grays, this little painting, a sketch for a larger one, has never earned any money in its life. Useless and free, it has spent 70 years as a minor family relic, handed along collaterally to owners who looked at it sometimes, or didn't bother to. It must be Nova Scotia. Only there does one see gabled wooden houses painted that awful shade of brown. The other houses, the bits that show, are white. Elm trees, low hills, a thin church steeple, that gray-blue wisp, or is it? In the foreground, a water meadow with some tiny cows, 2 brushstrokes each, but confidently cows. 2 minuscule white geese in the blue water, back to back, feeding, and a slanting stick. Up closer, a wild iris, white and yellow, fresh squiggled from the tube. The air is fresh and cold, cold early spring, clear as gray glass. A half-inch of blue sky below the steel-gray storm clouds. They were the artist's specialty. A speck-like bird is flying to the left. Or is it a fly speck, looking like a bird? Heavens, I recognize the place. I know it. It's behind, I can almost remember the farmer's name. His barn backed on that meadow. There it is, titanium white, 1 dab. A hint of steeple, filaments of brush hairs, barely there. Must be the Presbyterian church. Would that be Miss Gillespie's house? Those particular geese and cows are naturally before my time. A sketch done in an hour, in one breath, once taken from a trunk and handed over. Would you like this? I'll never have room to hang these things again. Your Uncle George, no, my Uncle George, he'd be your great-uncle, left them all with Mother when he went back to England. You know, he was quite famous, an R.A. I never knew him. We both knew this place, apparently, this literal small backwater, looked at it long enough to memorize it, our years apart. How strange. And it's still loved, or its memory is. It must have changed a lot. Our visions coincided. Visions is too serious a word. Our looks, two looks. Art copying from life, and life itself. Life and the memory of it so compressed, they've turned into each other. Which is which? Life and the memory of it cramped, dim, on a piece of Bristol board. Dim, but how live, how touching in detail. The little that we get for free, the little of our earthly trust, not much. About the size of our abidance along with theirs, the munching cows, the iris crisp and shivering, the water still standing from spring freshets, the yet to be dismantled elms, the geese. So I'm going to look at those Sam qualities. Spontaneity is everywhere in poem. The voice that speaks the poem is itself as alive as that shivering iris, fresh squiggled from the tube. As the speaker stops and starts, asserts and qualifies her assertions, shifting in tone from the parenthetical aside to the exclamatory, from a collage-y bit of reported dialogue to a meditation on memory, time, and the intimacies of art. We feel as though we are hearing a real person talking in real time, as if she's just there across the table chatting with us. It's not chat, of course, not tossed off or partially considered. The poet has revised and revised toward that illusion of casual, off-the-cuff, in one breath naturalness. It's an artificially created naturalness, an artfully rehearsed spontaneity. Heavens, I recognize the place. I know it, the speaker says, as if she had just then realized and is just now telling us. A just then that happens over and over every time you read the poem. Hers is a spontaneity that endures in the language of the poem. The next Sam quality, accuracy, isn't just about sticking to the facts, although Bishop rarely veers from fact in order to find some kind of capital T truth. Is there any such thing, she might ask? Her idea of accuracy isn't only about the honest admission of ugliness either. That awful shade of brown, she says, about her beloved Nova Scotia houses. Nor is her accuracy only for recalled details like Miss Gillespie's name or the size of American versus Canadian dollars. Bishop's accuracy isn't about verisimilitude or realism per se, although sometimes a sort of magnified superrealism may result. Her sort of accuracy is inherent in her precise and uncannily strange images. A toucan posed like an inverted comma, say, or this passage in poem, a speck-like bird is flying to the left, or is it a fly speck looking like a bird? These are accurate images that show in their accuracy how weird the ordinary actually is. The size of things shifts as that famous magnifying eye finds its focus. A bird as tall and colorful as the family-sized box of Fruit Loops is compared to a tiny black comma. A painted gull is compared to a flying speck, or a speck of fly is mistaken for a laughing gull. In the precision and defamiliarized strangeness of her images, heavens, I recognize the thing. Our perspective shifts, and aware of our looking, we see with sudden vividness and accuracy, although sometimes the view is like the one a suddenly giant Alice saw through the Wonderland keyhole, or the one we see through the glass in a Joseph Cornell assemblage. Bishop loved both, by the way, Alice and Cornell. Sometimes her realism, as with the trompe-l'oeil fly speck, asks us to question the real at the same time as it seems to represent it. The last of the Sam the Toucan triad of key poetic qualities is mystery, the one hardest to describe. But here's what I think it isn't. It isn't the dark murkiness of imprecision, or an answer withheld until the whodunit ends, or some deep hidden meaning set down in spark notes. Bishop's mystery isn't knowledge obscured or withheld from us readers. It's not a something added either, like a grating of nutmeg. Rather, it has something to do with the way in poem a very well-known poet and an unknown outsider artist are connected. How strange, she says. How strange that their two looks should coincide, compressing life and the memory of it, such that they've turned into each other. Which is which? Life or the memory of it? The real or the language of it? How strange art is. Listen again to the final lines. But how live, how touching in detail, the little we get for free, the little of our earthly trust, not much. About the size of our abidance along with theirs, the munching cows, the iris crisp and shivering, the water still standing from spring freshets, the yet to be dismantled elms, the geese. Spontaneously alive in voice, vision, and language, touchingly and ferociously accurate in detail, and mysteriously simple, the little we get for free. As birthdays remind us, it's not much, these few years, the size of our abidance. We are all of us like the green and yet to be dismantled elms. At least part of the mystery that animates a poem like Poem, or The Sandpiper, The Moose, Crusoe in England, all those great poems, is the human connection we feel to a somehow still living, greenish speaker, and the poet who gave her voice. It's the same mysterious connection she feels to the artist squiggling paint from the tube. I think of influence like that. The greenish effect of connection, the connection you feel as you read I'm changing as I go. The connection you feel as you read to a living presence there, kind of beyond the language, in the poem, the person and the maker of the poems. Heavens, I recognize you in that sidestepped rhyme, that formal reserve, or the way you made your sentence sound so spontaneously off the cuff. Why not court that connection? Why not listen and accept its magnetic draw? Far from feeling anxious about Elizabeth Bishop's influence, I seek it. What the heck? And rather than wanting to copy her, or to outdo or supplant her as if I ever could, I hope my work, all our poetry work, helps her poetry, all poetry, keep its green, not yet dismantled Samminess. So you'll hear for yourselves, I'm about to read some poems. You'll hear if I've managed to get anything Sammy into my poems. I'm going to read two from the new book, the first of which is an homage to my grandmother and also kind of sideways to Bishop. And my grandmother and Bishop were about of a generation. Where's the poem? They both were born in New England, and college educated, which in that generation for a woman was not that common. My grandmother kind of liked poems. She liked them especially for other people. She thought everyone should read them. But she loved wildflowers. That was her real passion. She's the first person who ever said she thought I should be a poet. She gave me my first book of poems that I ever owned, which was the collected Wallace Stevens. So that's a pretty good one. When you're 14, you know, that's a place to start. But this poem is called Landscape with Bloodroot. She demanded I pay attention. For example, to the wildflowers we walked by, not just the easy ones like Queen Anne's lace or butter and eggs, but harder, stranger ones, trailing arbutus, hepatica, dead man's pipes. To tell the truth, I didn't always love wholly our walks and her half-stern, half-joking catechism. What's that? What's that one called? When she pointed to a flower I couldn't name, we collected a sprig to bring home to the other Bible. Her headstone heavy, precious, we had to wash our hands first, North American wildflowers. She made it my work to count the petals, assess the leaves, serrated or smooth, lobed, alternate, waxy, downy, then keeping in mind the season and context, field, slope, brookside, to page through my favorite part and solve the mystery. We paired the real to the right illustration and proper name. When I asked how a flower got its name, why fleabane, cowslip, St. John's, I thought it was wort with an A. Some of the stories she knew. Others I know now she made up whole cloth, and at least once, stumped, or who knows why now, she asked me, why am I Martha? Why are you Jen? She'd be saddened by how much I've forgotten. Which celandine is greater, which blue aster is which, and just where in the Cockaponsett woods her favorite pink turning white arbutus grew, and perhaps grows still. I've not lost altogether, though, her lessons, the habit of close attention, the pleasure of names and of seeing in the actual sprig the guidebook's painted version, as well as the deep, harder here to confess, heart leaps up joy in recognition. As on an April wooded hillside, when white, gold-stamined stars open among the underrot, 8-petaled from a basil rosette of bluish lobed leaves. I can almost hear the name in her voice, Bloodroot. This is a brand new book for me. I've never read from it before. Just came out. This next one is called Landscape with Goat's Eye, and it takes place in India, near Bodh Gaya, in Bodh Gaya, where the historical Buddha sat underneath the fig tree until he reached enlightenment, or so the story goes. Landscape, there's a lot of goats there. Landscape with Goat's Eye. A page where the flip book of memories always opens, or when thumbed through stutters and stops. The road is a pale dust track. The bullock's hoofbeats muffled, wooden cartwheels creak. On the horizon, the high fig tree, fruitless in this season, rocks with the jounce of the cart. Through sleepy Bodh Gaya, a boy rides his slope-shouldered buffalo past temples and tea stalls, pilgrims and tourists. Among them, but refusing, stubborn, the tree's sacred shade, I buy bread and bananas and feed the peels and overripe bits to the goats. The dust is a variorum of tracks. The bullock's hooves beat steady, wooden cartwheels creak. On the horizon and overhead, the pale, changeable, cataracted sky. I set sweet rice aside on the plate, practicing renunciation, practicing restraint, or was it compassion? And the goats butt and nudge, more than companionably. So much forgotten, but not that goaty, cowlicked, knobby head, the loose drape of her ears, and that fixed eye, a sliver of goat inscrutable gold leaf, as if lifted from an icon sky, barely lustrous, sheer and creased. The road from the station is pale, the bullocks' hoofbeats, weathered traces, wooden cartwheels creak, wearing furrows in the dust. And one more, a little one, very different. I think still there's some Bishop in it, but not maybe as much as those two. This is from a book called Canticle of the Night Path, and all the poems in it are in the same rough form. That is, each has 5 things, 5 couplets, 5 lines, 5 sentences, or 5 paragraphs. And that's about all that they have in common. But they're in alphabetical order. So Canticle of A is the first one. An almanac of almost and almonds, amended accounts, always askance, aslant, as chance would have it. An atlas at last of aphorism and aftermath, of master, ochre, mask, and umber, all had for an anaphoric song. An archive of lives and ghosts, haloed and half-cocked, a canticle of alpha to Z, apple to zebra, aardvark to zarf. A gospel of asters, of ask her, of azure assurance not gone askew, an adder, an attar of roses and ashes, a Webster's of wishes, word lists, of what-ifs and why-nots, wine cups kept ever brim-full. Thank you.
I didn't actually prepare any remarks, which might be your misfortune, because I can ramble all day about Elizabeth Bishop. And but what I'm actually going to do is give you a sense, because Anya asked me to when we talked about this, of my relationship to her. And I want to say, first of all, that I was one of the early adopters of Elizabeth Bishop, before she became kind of the agreed upon canonical poet in, the Tong Wars of American poetry, the one that, every faction could say was a great poet. And that sort of started happening around the 1980s. And I encountered Bishop because a very influential book when I was an early reader of poetry was Life Studies, and of course the great poem that ends Life Studies, Skunk Hour, is dedicated to Elizabeth Bishop. So I knew the name at a time when she wasn't very well read in America, and left out of major anthologies and stuff like that. And she had kind of had returned to America from a long period in Brazil and was trying to cobble together a life up in Boston, and not many people knew about her, and things seemed to have passed her by, but she was always interesting to me because of the Lowell connection, and because from sort of the mid-1970s on, I worked in the fishing industry on the West Coast and the Northwest Coast. And Bishop is, of course, one of the great maritime poets. And I had her book, and I recognized that immediately about her. And also the one connection I had to literature at that time was a subscription to the New Yorker. And if you were a subscriber of the New Yorker in the 1970s, you would get the magazine, and I would read it every week, and every once in a while a Bishop poem would appear. And these were the poems in Geography 3, and they were kind of masterpiece after masterpiece. I mean, they were just, it's a very, very small book, but, about as perfect a book of poetry as one can find. And I would read the poems and be intrigued by them. I mean, I remember Poem when it came in the New Yorker, and Crusoe in England, and I can't remember the sequence, but at a certain time in that period, the New Yorker published the second of Bishop's 2 birthday poems. The first is one called The Bite, which is sort of not necessarily a favorite of mine. The second one is called In the Waiting Room, which when I was teaching poetry, I would introduce it to my students by saying, "This is the greatest poem ever written." And then I would go on to say that this is the greatest poem ever written because this is the greatest poem that could possibly be written, because it's about the absolute limit of human experience, the thing that we recognize when we recognize self and being, and that, you cannot aspire to a loftier subject, and you can never arrive at it. It will always slip away from you. And in fact, this is a poem about almost arriving at a certain fundamental revelation, a certain enlightenment, and having it slip away from you. And so I read this poem, when I was living on the Oregon coast, and it just dazzled me. So this poet I had read, who I thought was kind of a good poet, and who I had a lot of respect for and had admired, I think, for a lot of reasons that were adventitious. She represented a kind of culture that I regarded as authentic. She was an embodiment of a certain kind of down east Anglo-Saxon nonconformism that I recognized as kind of a thread in American culture. She had, what Emerson famously called a transparent eyeball. She just kind of, the world reflected. I mean, when one reads Bishop and sees the way she sees, like, you're always reminded of that famous saying of Goethe's, and Goethe said at one point, "It is better to think than to do, better to feel than to think, but best of all, merely to look." And she allows you to look and look and look inexhaustibly. And so I recognized and appreciated all of that, and I loved the diction and the natural tone. It connected me to other writers whom I admired in a kind of historical continuity, going back through Yeats to Wordsworth, the conversational tone, the commitment to prose order, all of those things I was picking up because that was a time when I was living in Oregon when I was trying to make myself into a poet along with all the other things I was doing. And, and then I came across this poem and I realized that this person who I thought was, a model of a certain kind of literary virtue and a certain kind of clarity and simplicity and order was actually an incredibly dramatically ambitious poet. And I'll read In the Waiting Room, and then I will read kind of its companion poem, At the Fish Houses. And this is the first poem in Geography 3, in the waiting room. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist's appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. It was winter. It got dark early. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, Arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time, and while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read, and carefully studied the photographs. The inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Osa and Martin Johnson, dressed in riding breeches, laced boots, and pith helmets. A dead man slung on a pole. Long pig, the caption said. Babies with pointed heads wound round and round with string. Black, naked women with necks wound round and round with wire, like the necks of light bulbs. Their breasts were horrifying. I read it right straight through. I was too shy to stop. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly, from inside, came an "oh" of pain. Aunt Consuelo's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice, in my mouth. Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I, you are an Elizabeth, you are one of them. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look, to see what it was I was. I gave a sidelong glance. I couldn't look any higher. At shadowy gray knees, trousers and skirts and boots, and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. Why should I be my aunt, or me, or anyone? What similarities, boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts, held us all together or made us all just one? How? I didn't know any word for it. How unlikely. How had I come to be here, like them, and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse, but hadn't? The waiting room was bright and too hot. It was sliding beneath a big black wave, another and another. Then I was back in it. The war was on. Outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, were night and slush and cold, and it was still the 5th of February, 1918. So that is about that moment of recognition, that moment of being, that we arrive and arrive and arrive at, and always, seem to slip past at the moment of our arrival. And it's interesting, at the end of her life, she goes back to that experience, which is sort of, And she frames it in an interesting way. She frames it in the context of herself, because that experience has many facets, and often when you look at Bishop as a whole, you tend to sort of see her as either a Christian poet in a post-Christian world, or a post-Christian poet, still laboring in a Christian world. And there's kind of that constant tension, a doubling of her sort of spiritual consciousness. And, and at the end of her life, she seems to have freed herself from the contradictions that sort of defined and fructified her poetry throughout its, flowering in her life, and just gets back to an irresolvable existential core and dilemma, and that is not really true about the middle part of her career. It's sort of, that question isn't sort of reducible, that question of being isn't reducible in the middle part of her career to merely the existential condition of the self, but has all of this sort of doctrinal fullness to it. And an example of that is the next poem I'm going to read, At the Fish Houses, which is sort of, I guess in a way, the companion poem to In the Waiting Room, in some way, and, I think she tends to sort of recycle motifs throughout her career because, well, for one reason, because she worked on poems for so long, I think The Moose was around for 25 years before it got finished. It was just, I think it's late 1948 that she takes that, that bus ride that The Moose describes, and she doesn't publish that poem until the 1970s. So there's a kind of constant return to certain ideas and themes which reflects a sort of atemporal reality in which she was always living. It's kind of really interesting. And I think even poem has I think that painting is actually mentioned earlier in her work. I can't remember exactly where it is now, but that painting comes back again at the end. So it's sort of, and this is sort of the theme of In the Waiting Room, conceived and understood from a different point of view entirely. At the Fish Houses. Although it is a cold evening, down by one of the fish houses, an old man sits netting, his net in the gloaming almost invisible, a dark purple-brown, and his shuttle worn and polished. The air smells so strong of codfish it makes one's nose run and one's eyes water. The 5 fish houses have steeply peaked roofs, and narrow cleated gangplanks slant up to storerooms in the gables for the wheelbarrows to be pushed up and down on. All is silver. The heavy surface of the sea, swelling slowly as if considering spilling over, is opaque, but the silver of the benches, the lobster pots and masts scattered among the wild, jagged rocks is of an apparent translucence, like the small old buildings with an emerald moss growing on their shoreward walls. The big fish tubs are completely lined with layers of beautiful herring scales, and the wheelbarrows are similarly plastered with creamy, iridescent coats of mail, with small, iridescent flies crawling on them. Up on the little slope behind the houses, set in the sparse, bright sprinkle of grass, is an ancient wooden capstan, cracked, with 2 long bleached handles and some melancholy stains like dried blood, where the ironwork is rusted. The old man accepts a lucky strike. He was a friend of my grandfather. We talk of the decline in the population and of codfish and herring while he waits for a herring boat to come in. There are sequins on his vest and on his thumb. He has scraped the scales, the principal beauty, from unnumbered fish with that black old knife, the blade of which is almost worn away. Down at the water's edge, at the place where they haul up the boats, up the long ramp descending into the water, thin silver tree trunks are laid horizontally, across the gray stones, down and down, at intervals of 4 or 5 feet. Cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear, element bearable to no mortal, to fish and to seals. One seal particularly I have seen here evening after evening. He was curious about me. He was interested in music. Like me, a believer in total immersion. So I used to sing him Baptist hymns. I also sang, "A mighty fortress is our God." He stood up in the water and regarded me steadily, moving his head a little. Then he would disappear, then suddenly emerge almost in the same spot, with a sort of shrug, as if it were against his better judgment. Cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear, the clear gray icy water. Back behind us the dignified tall firs begin, bluish, associating with their shadows. A million Christmas trees stand, waiting for Christmas. The water seems suspended above the rounded gray and blue-gray stones. I have seen it over and over, the same sea, the same slightly indifferently swinging above the stones, icily free above the stones and then the world. If you should dip your hand in, your wrist would ache immediately, your bones would begin to ache, and your hand would burn as if the water were a transmutation of fire that feeds on stones and burns with a dark gray flame. If you tasted it, it would first taste bitter, then briny, then surely burn your tongue. It is like what we imagine knowledge to be. Dark, salt, clear, moving, utterly free, drawn from the cold, hard mouth of the world, derived from the rocky breasts, forever, flowing and drawn, and, since our knowledge is historical, flowing and flown. She always starts out so low, so even, you know, there's just kind of that. And you never quite realize how much pressure is building up because the control is so magnificent, you know, the kind of, the mastery of the sentence, the commitment to like living the poem along the sentence and seeing its opportunities and expanding it outward, but at the same time, there is this other narrative taking place in her mind that, you know, of which we are just getting tiny little glimpses. You know, we don't quite understand what's going on, but the way in which she sort of continually shepherds us, you know, further and further and further, until she can't go any further, you know. I mean, in some sense, she kind of always arrives at a limit that's fundamental in some way, I think. And, you know, and I think one of the, you know, I think a part of it is always when I've contemplated her, and of course I've contemplated her a lot, she was a poet who freed me, along with Auden, when I was kind of in my sort of early and mid-20s, freed me from the terrible burden of having to write like John Ashbery. Because he was sort of like, when I was a kid, I was a hip young poetry reader and literature reader, and Ashbery was really cool. This was like before Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, when he was sort of a New York coterie figure, and all the hip literary kids I knew came from New York, and they listened to the Velvet Underground, and they read John Ashbery. And I thought I had to be like them, but I couldn't quite be like them, you know. But I recognized the distinction of someone like Ashbery, and I sort of felt, well, I had to find another model. And Bishop came along. I mean, she was really a lifeline for me in that way, And I sort of felt like, oh, yeah, this is really great. And it seems in some way unmarked by time. It seems like there seems to be something perennial about these concerns. They will always be the same concerns. Seems to be something absolutely eternal about the allegiance. The allegiance to language at this level, the recognition that language is sort of a living thing and you have to get out of its way and let it do what it should do. And then, the commitment to the world, especially the visual world. And there's something beyond these kind of games we're playing. And also I think there's a kind of historicity too, because Bishop she never abandoned the romantic ode. She's like kind of the person of her generation who continued to write them after people like Rutke and Lowell and Berryman sort of let them go and started trying to do something else. She was kind of committed to that, to that great series of poems that begin, in the 1790s and, move up to her, and she managed them. She managed them very beautifully. And so she was very important to me, and it's great to come down here and sort of be allowed to celebrate her, and thank her in some way. Although she's dead and gone. I mean, she's not listening to us. I'm sure. Positive. Anyway, I'm going to read a poem of mine, and which is a recent poem, and I guess it's sort of it's Bishop-like in a lot of ways, but it's also a celebration of sight. And it's a poem about my mother, who's very old and kind of, in distressed physical condition now. And she also is, like Bishop, a strong, inscrutable woman. The poem is called Your Living Eyes. They wheeled you, your caregivers did, to the picture window to watch the birds fretting at the feeder. Then they forgot you there and you forgot them. 1,000 years later, the angel of death sidled in, disguised as a little girl, clutching at her pinafore and chewing the ends of her pigtails. She had a look whose vacancy was over-rehearsed. But I hear your interview with her went well. I hear, actually, that it went better than anybody could ever have thought it would. She said, beauty and sadness are never far apart. You said, bullshit. She said, some birds are real, some are invisible, but which are which? You said, back off, bitch. She stared out the window. Her eyes narrowed, but they didn't touch. What was she seeing? What was she saying to herself? Do I know, or do I care? Enough with these impassive forces, this one or that other one, the one who gave you life, you who gave me life. The yellow of the finches is as molten as ever, splashing on the holly bushes. The moon, pale white inside the pale blue morning, dropping its panicles of glass on the bright grass, is climbing up, but the sun is climbing down. The world your eyes see is the world as it really is, and you and I are going to live in it forever, and we will hitchhike to the painted hills together and hop a freight back home. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Manavong, curator in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. First of all, I'd like to thank our readers for being here today, and also the Poetry and Literature Center. Oh, I'm sorry. I'd like to thank the Poetry and Literature Center for organizing this wonderful event. In addition to the Rare Book collection, our renowned Rare Book collection in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, we also hold more than 100 special collections, one of which is our Poets Laureate collection, which is our attempt to bring together all the works of the Poets Laureate of the United States and have a repository here at the home of the Poet Laureate. Elizabeth Bishop, having been a Poet Laureate, is represented in this collection, and I've brought together several things that she produced and that we hold. The first of which is the first edition of her first book, North and South, as well as the book that won her the Pulitzer Prize, Poems, North and South, A Cold Spring, 1955. And in addition to just, first editions and monographs, we also hold broadsides, chapbooks, and also bibliographical oddities, one of which is a pair called The Fish. And that's a broadside that was produced by David Ishii of Seattle. He was a bookseller and an avid fisherman. And he decided at some point to have a broadside of her poem, The Fish, produced, mainly to distribute to friends. But of course, it was an unauthorized copy of her poem. And when he approached her and asked her to sign it, she refused. She did relent a couple of years later when he attended one of her readings and asked her again. So that's up here. It's one of 12 copies that were produced. We're one of the few institutions that hold it. And we just acquired this, so you'll be some of the first people to see it up here. So that's all I have. Please do stop up. I have a list of works exhibited at the end of the table. Please help yourself. And feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.